Hi, I'm David Blakesley, and I'm here to give a review of King Lear. This is Jean-Luc Godard's 1987 film, a very loose, expansive, this marginally connected adaptation of King Lear. It's basically Godard's riff on one quote or one interaction between the elder King Lear and his daughter Cordelia that takes place in Act 1, Scene 1 of the film, where Cordelia fails to offer her father the flattery that he was expecting nothing or no thing. Anyways, that's just a little bit of a preamble about this film. This has been an important missing piece, as I've recently learned, for those who've really followed Godard's career. The great French Nouvelle Vague, New Wave director, very influential for Breathless, Vive sa vie, Pierrot Le Fou, just all kinds of fascinating stuff that he did in the 1960s. He took his cinematic activism very seriously to the point of getting deeply involved in political struggle and resistance against the French government in the late 1960s, continued on this path into the early 70s, and then returned it to mainstream cinema of a sort, casting known actors and stars and stories that had some kind of a semi-conventional structure. Every Man for Himself, a previous Criterion release from several years ago, marked Godard's return to sort of cinematic circles in the 1980s, and King Lear is kind of the capstone of a particular phase of Godard's career. So I've tried a few different times to review this film and made a few different videos that I've decided not to publish because I've been on this kind of journey. Watched the film, I made a video right after that and said, okay, fascinating, interesting, I'm intrigued, but I need to do some better preparation to get on this guy's wavelength. Because I'll just say this, if you're just a movie watcher of all kinds of different stuff, you have very eclectic tastes, but if you just pop this in the midst of a shuffle of whatever other types of movies you're going to watch, this might not do a whole lot for you. I really feel like this is a director that you've got to kind of get into their vocabulary, their cinematic language. And Godard himself very much is playing with the whole format of how a film is put together and how it presents itself to the audience. He's really an experimenter with the art of cinema, of film as an art form, because he's also doing fascinating stuff with the sound design, the soundtrack, the multi-layering of things that you see on screen and different voices and sound effects and sounds from nature, all kind of blended together. Quotes, subliminal statements that are almost hard to pick up until you've gone through the film a couple times, or maybe even more. These are texts to be studied, reviewed, reflected upon, returned to, and revisited. And that's a different way of consuming cinema, right, as well as presenting it. And so King Lear just has different elements going on. It's Godard's reflection on this particular play and this moment, the relationship between fathers and daughters, with some incestuous overtones weaving its way, not into the acted performances, but things that he does in the editing and the post-production. There's also the presence of some interesting figures like Molly Ringwald as Cordelia, cast very particularly because she represented something as far as American cinematic royalty. She was a princess who had a very particular presence and place, a significance. She epitomized something at that point in the late 1980s after 16 Candles and The Breakfast Club, and Molly Ringwald just had a particular spot in the firmament that he wanted to bring into this story. It's a fascinating work of Molly Ringwald's career because it was very underseen, even when she was at the height of her fame and popularity, because of the very meager distribution that the film got. She's also clothed, and she's wearing her own clothes. Godard didn't have a special wardrobe for her. So this is what she packed when she came to France or to Switzerland to do this movie. And there's no makeup, so you're seeing just the natural beauty of a young Molly Ringwald. And just fascinating because I was one of those viewers. I saw her in a certain way, and now here she is at that same age and stage of her personal development, popping up in this Godard art movie. Burgess Meredith plays Don Liaro, or the King Lear figure. He's an organized crime boss, and that's because there's a connection to Norman Mailer, who wrote the original first script, which maybe was not used at all, but he was attached to the project and appears in the opening scenes of the movie. So even the movie's own construction, the movie is telling the story of how it was made by, weaving, the production of the film into the text that you're reviewing itself. So it's a very postmodern, meta-y type of thing. There's other things going on as well. Godard himself plays this Professor Pluggy. He's got all of these cords hanging off of his head. They're kind of like electronic dreads or something like that. It's this kind of technical, brainiac, maniacal side of Godard, where the physical aspects of editing film and cutting things up and putting it back together again, and all of the focused intelligence and effort that he's putting towards constructing this film under some kind of unique circumstances. I'll talk about that in a second. But that's kind of, I think, what his character is epitomizing, and it's self-effacing, but it's also putting Godard out there as a central character in his own sort of psychodramas, which these movies are kind of an outworking of his inner life and his reflections and his experience of the world and his commentary on current events. One of the other things about this film is that it takes place after the Chernobyl disaster, which in the film's context wiped out all of human cultural civilization. Like all the great works of art had been obliterated somehow because of what happened in Chernobyl. But it's a metaphor for apocalyptic catastrophe. And there's a character played by the play director. He's the theatrical director, Peter Sellers. That's Sellars, not Peter Sellers from the Doctor Strangelove and Being There and Pink Panther movies. But Peter Sellers plays a character, William Shakespeare V Jr., or maybe it's Junior V, I forget at the moment. But he is kind of the narrative thread that kind of ties the movie together, because he's listening for dialogue so that he can recreate the lost works of Shakespeare. It's a strange conceit. I'm not really sure what it conveys or communicates, but it's Godard engaging with figures like Shakespeare as part of his own art. And that's kind of something that I picked up as I was watching a lot of the in-between movies, because I made that in that earlier video. I talked about the Studio Canal set here with 4 films, Passion, First Name Carmen, and Detective. I watched all 3 of those. There's also Woe Is Me, but that was a 90s film. I haven't gotten to that one yet. I watched Hail Mary, and I just recently acquired and watched Keep Your Right Up, which is a film that he started making before King Lear, had to put it on the shelf for a while, and then after King Lear was put together, then he finished up Keep Up Your Right, which you can see that's Godard himself, and he also appears in that movie. So he had a little bit of an acting career that he liked to, stoke the flames every once in a while. But back to King Lear. So this was this film was a result of a cocktail napkin contract that he signed with the Canon organization. And I don't really know a lot about those characters. It's discussed elsewhere, but it was basically a kind of a schlocky studio that had made more like low budget action movies. They wanted to get into the art house game. They did some work with Cassavetes to produce Love Streams. So, they were flexing and stretching out a little bit. So they got Godard, maybe for a prestige hire, asked him to do King Lear. He agreed to it, got financing, and then the project meandered, and nothing was really happening for a while until pressure was applied by the guy who's actually, his voicemail is featured right at the beginning of the movie, where he's kind of haranguing Godard. It's like, where's my movie? Let's get this ready for the Cannes Film Festival. And, Godard is asked to respond, and he says action, and the movie's up and running. There's Norman Mailer. But anyways, so Godard basically started running up against a hard deadline and realized he could really take a financial hit, and he just needed to get this done. So, there's a pressurized situation that resulted in the making of the film and putting it together on the time frame that it did. And that probably affected Godard's kind of psychological approach to this material. But because it didn't really meet the expectations that the Cannon Group had, this was not a commercially marketable film, despite the presence of Molly Ringwald as a big star. It's just too abstract and opaque and pretentious and all that other stuff that is just not going to connect with, even a sophisticated film goer who is cinematically literate and all of that. It's just on such a different wavelength, this King Lear. But if you spend enough time, like I've done recently, just watching, these movies and orienting yourself to Godard's approach, I think King Lear makes a very satisfying culmination of, the films I quoted earlier or mentioned earlier that I've been watching. So I think that's my review. This is, again, if you really want to get into Godard and understand his importance and his place as a creator of, durable, lasting, innovative, fascinating, and potently expressive cinema of the highest artistic caliber, then, this is an important piece. I don't really know the story about why it was so hard to finally get on disc, but it looks great. The lighting, the cinematography is gorgeous. He just really knows how to shoot and make movies that just look splendid. And so, yeah, I give this very much a high endorsement. If my comments here have intrigued you, but if you're just looking for something, more on the entertaining, engaging side, this is probably not it for you. So let the buyer beware. Oops, I forgot to talk about the bonus features on this disc. So there's the list right there. Now let me just kind of share with you a few impressions, kind of going in reverse order. The last thing that's on the menu is a 1987 interview that Godard gave at the Cannes Film Festival that year. And it's actually pretty straightforward. I mean, he does, some kind of elliptical, cryptic type of stuff. But for the most part, he's pretty engaged, and I think he gives interesting answers to the questions and takes some interesting sort of theories from some of the viewers who are trying to figure out what he was doing here, because of course this is their first time seeing it, and it is a pretty mystifying film at your first encounter, especially at the time where, you got Molly Ringwald and Burgess Meredith, and what's that Norman Mailer thing doing here? It's just, it's puzzling. But then there's also a couple of really nice interviews. One is with Peter Sellers, the stage director, who really did have a pretty critical role in pulling this production together. He even though I've kind of focused on Molly Ringwald, she's a bit of a side character, really. I mean, Peter Sellers as William Shakespeare Jr. the Fifth, or Fifth Jr., he's kind of the glue as far as giving this film something of a narrative through line here, as he's in that quest to recreate the lost plays of his illustrious ancestor. But he gives some great kind of context and background of the making of the film and his interactions with Godard doing this piece, which is interesting to say. This is an English language film, so even though I've kind of intimated that this is a film that you should watch after you've kind of prepped for it by watching Godard's earlier stuff, in some ways it's an ideal introduction to Godard for an English language speaking audience, because you don't have to spend so much time reading the subtitles. Sometimes you might want them on, because the way that the sound effects and the sound design can sometimes overpower the spoken words. If you're conditioned to reading subtitles, that'll pick you up, help you pick up the nuances of what's being said a little bit more clearly than just listening to it. At least that's how it works for me in my experience. There's another interview with Molly Ringwald, contemporary interview from these days, looking back, and it's pretty touching actually, because she's talking about kind of a pretty special period in her life when she really was at the top of the heap, a young film star. She had a very unique experience, and admits that she was pretty mystified and uncertain of what he was asking her to do, was wondering why she wasn't learning more Shakespeare lines or having to take on other, scenes in the character of Cordelia. So, anyways, it's pretty charming and a really nice supplement. I think a lot of people might have find that one pretty enjoyable. And then there's the Richard Brody, kind of the lead-off essay. It's the first supplement that comes up on the menu. And we'll just get a load of this quote here, and let me know what you think of it.
Does Lear walk thus? Speak thus? Where are his eyes? Where are his eyes?
King Lear is the best film of all time. The film contains an absolute maximum of ideas and emotions regarding the art of cinema, the art of adaptation, the literary source on the basis of which it was made. And Orson Welles made the greatest direct Shakespeare film, Chimes at Midnight, but even that was still a film of one play. With King Lear, Godard made a film of Shakespeare. He made a film of what a cinematic Shakespearean world could be. And it's pretty much the culmination of everything that Godard had been working on in the previous decade, both publicly and behind the scenes.
So this is basically, it's a curiosity piece for a lot of people. I would imagine it's probably not going to be one of the top selling titles from Criterion in February 25, but I'm really glad I've got it. I'm enjoying my my exploration of 80s Godard, and now that I've finished that, yes, I am getting into this. His notorious kind of bridge from the middle period to the late period, Histoire du cinéma.